Who would have thought that this could possibly happen in the United Kingdom? Well, it has. Who would think today that it could possibly happen in South Korea? Well, it could. It then tries to take over how we educate our children, how we run our churches and define our beliefs. And it even tries to censor our speech and challenge the very beliefs that we hold as Christians, suggesting that they are not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Suggesting that they are not worthy of respect in a society based on equality considerations. The result has been the mainstreaming of anti-Christian bias and anti-Christian discrimination into the cultural fabric of the United Kingdom. And this is why it's really important for all public leaders, including pastors, to understand that this is a gospel issue. It cannot be left to politicians, it cannot be left to lawyers, it cannot be left to educators, it cannot be left to government. It is something that is firmly needs to be dealt with within the church and within the church's people. Hello, I'm Andrea Williams, Chief Executive of Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre. It is always my great joy to speak to the people of South Korea. I only wish that I could be with you in these strange and unique times in our world at the moment. My subject today is anti-discrimination laws in the United Kingdom. And I hope that by speaking to the anti-discrimination laws in the United Kingdom, we can teach a lesson to you in South Korea for what happens when they are implemented, the trajectory, and how important it is for those of you that are Christians, those of you that are lawyers, those of you that are teachers, pastors, those of you that are society leaders, that you will understand their nature, you will understand what happens and why it is so important to tackle them for the good of society. So I thank you for your kind invitation to speak to you today. It's worth, first of all, noting that anti-discrimination is not an issue that exists in a vacuum. There are numerous root causes that create a culture that lead to the kind of tribalism and identity policies that are at the heart of the equality agenda that we see so clearly in the West and which is coming to you in South Korea. I call it an equality agenda because anti-discrimination law has very little to do with equality and a lot to do with politics. That's why it's important that the politicians, the lawyers, the educators understand very clearly what it is that I'm saying, and also the pastors. At its heart, anti-discrimination defines people by various minority characteristics and focuses on our differences rather than our similarities. Instead of bringing people together in the shared understanding that we are born into the radical equality and the shared dignity of being created in God's image. And that is something that we in Britain have enjoyed historically in our laws. But today that has gone through the equality agenda. And this agenda breeds suspicion among people and the belief that because of their differences, they tend to be victimised by society more than others. Being a victim, in turn, can breed contempt for those that others view as their victimisers. As we have seen time and time again in the United Kingdom, anti-discrimination law pushes people to fighting for their perceived individual rights to be more equal than others. The philosophy underpinning the anti-discrimination agenda has led to such things as critical race theory, which has bred movements like Black Lives Matter and spawned protests which often become violent in the United States. It has led to an insidious form of cultural Marxism, where our entire history and culture is treated with suspicion and disdain, with an aim to fully dismantling it. So today, in Britain, much of British history is unknown and not properly analysed. And the way that it is taught in the academies and the way that it is spoken of in political life and even in our education in schools is with disdain. The so-called Christian heritage is one to be ashamed of, not celebrating for the good that it has done. This philosophy has led to a transgender theory today where biological sex no longer matters. It's subjective feeling that counts. I can be whatever gender I aspire to be or no gender at all. It is a war of nature and ultimately on God's sovereignty and the creation order. This philosophy has also created the LGBTQI movement, which has for the past 30 years in society sought to deconstruct heteronormativity, to thereby redefine the family, in fact to smash the family, and to end what they believe to be straight privilege. Perhaps the greatest challenge of the anti-discrimination agenda is that it is all-encompassing. It usually starts in the area of employment or housing, and then it expands to the provision of goods and services. However, where the agenda is most advanced, like in the United Kingdom, it then tries to take over how we educate our children, how we run our churches and define our beliefs, and it even tries to censor our speech and challenge the very beliefs that we hold as Christians, suggesting that they are not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Suggesting that they are not worthy of respect in a society based on equality considerations. The result has been the mainstreaming of anti-Christian bias and anti-Christian discrimination into the cultural fabric of the United Kingdom. And this is why it's really important for all public leaders, including pastors, to understand that this is a gospel issue. It cannot be left to politicians, it cannot be left to lawyers, it cannot be left to educators, it cannot be left to government. It is something that is firmly needs to be dealt with within the church and within the church's people. Anti-Christian bias is a predisposition against an individual or a group wholly or partly due to their Christian beliefs or practices. Who would have thought that this could possibly happen in the United Kingdom? Well, it has. Who would think today that it could possibly happen in South Korea? Well, it could. So, anti-Christian bias first includes stereotyping Christians in a negative fashion, or representing Christian beliefs as oppressive, or backwards, or irrational, or hateful. It deals with mainstreaming the equality agenda, so mainstream and applauding and celebrating gay icon figures, and any that don't celebrate but continue to speak Christian orthodoxy on the subject are vilified as hateful and backward and irrational and not with the times. This also includes individuals, employers, organisations and even government actors going out of their way to respect the demands of other faiths or beliefs, but not of Christians. The bias against Christians is rarely, if ever, challenged by the political or media class in the United Kingdom and in the West. It's become one of the few acceptable prejudices in the United Kingdom that it has become culturally acceptable. Anti-Christian discrimination is discrimination against a person or a group of people wholly or partly due to their Christian beliefs or practices. This would include discrimination against someone because of his or her beliefs about marriage, life, the unborn children, or sexual ethics. It would also include discrimination against someone because they have a conscientious objection to sensitive moral matters such as abortion or compelled use of transgender programs. One of the chief problems facing Christians in the United Kingdom today, especially those who faithfully adhere to biblical belief, is the shocking level of religious illiteracy in our culture. For more than 2 decades, both the media and the LGBT campaigning groups have hammered it into the collective consciousness that any opposition to any campaigning goal of the LGBT community or to homosexual behaviour itself is hateful, homophobic, small-minded. Biblical Christian belief during this period has been attacked ruthlessly along these same lines. That is why it's vital that the churches and that Christians in public life speak lovingly but strongly and clearly and in truth into the public arena at this time, at the very beginning that these laws begin to take shape and place in the society of South Korea. In our nation, the Christian voices that have dissented have been very few. Churches have far too often not defended biblical belief, but have instead gone quiet on it, sought to be loving and caring, sought to say very clearly, we are places of welcome, we do not judge, which of course is true, but then not to say anything about the truth of God's moral code. They've gone on the defence to prove that they're not the type of Christian who would be an enemy of homosexuality. This is why in South Korea it is vital that we talk about the truth when it comes to sexual ethics from the get-go of this anti-discrimination legislation. Today, I will focus mainly on the 2 protected characteristics in the United Kingdom that equality law has posed and imposed and presents as the greatest existential threat to the free exercise of Christian faith in our nation. Those 2 protected characteristics are sexual orientation and gender reassignment. Let us first turn to the issue of sexual orientation. One of the chief problems that exists in defining what legal protections should be afforded to sexual orientation is a hermeneutical one. It's an understanding of what is meant. Put succinctly, the problem began, and I want the South Koreans to really hear this well, because of the lack of legal clarity in how sexual orientation is defined. Please don't make this same mistake at the outset in South Korea. When the Equality Framework Directive 2000 was being drafted, which would later create a legal obligation upon all European Union member states to adopt their own in-kind anti-discrimination legislation, it originally stated this, that with regard to sexual orientation, a clear dividing line should be drawn between sexual orientation, which is covered by this proposal, and sexual behaviour, which is not. Now, this clarifying statement never made it into the final binding directive. And so the confusion of whether sexual practice was included in sexual orientation has been inherited by the member states. What this means is that sexual orientation and sexual behaviour now becomes one. First of all, the notion of sexual orientation in the first place, that somebody is innately born gay, there's an issue with this. But now it in and of itself expands to mean protection over sexual behaviours so that they cannot be critiqued. The British Parliament has failed to cure this lack of legal certainty. So I think that what's important in South Korea is for you to understand this. When there is an anti-discrimination protection around sexual orientation, it means sexual practice. It means the celebration, the full protection, the promotion of homosexual ideology, fully blown homosexual relationships in society and the promotion of them. And so, as a minimum, this needs to be made clear from the start so that you can ensure conscience objections within the legislation. Or you need to say that sexual orientation does not extend to sexual behaviour. This, of course, already seeds the notion of sexual orientation, which may well, in and of itself, also be a difficult thing. Parliament had opportunity to cure this at various points, but it never did, because the lack of clarity in law can be useful. When defining sexual orientation in Section 2 of the Employment Equality Sexual Orientation Regulations of 2003, it simply used the circular definition that sexual orientation means one's sexual orientation towards persons of the same sex, persons of the opposite sex, or persons of the same sex or opposite sex. A nearly identical definition continues to be used to this day through the Equality Act of 2010. This confusion is compounded because sexual orientation can mean many different things depending on who is defining it. For some, it means sexual attraction. For others, it means their behaviour as well. This is particularly problematic because it suggests that moral opposition to sexual behaviour is somehow discriminatory. Others wish to include it as a worldview. This category of people suggests that any opposition to the LGBT campaigning points includes same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption and LGBT education of our children is homophobic and should be prohibited by anti-discrimination law. Let's turn to this latter category of people first. If you take away anything from today's talk, let it be this. Being homosexual and LGBT campaigning are not synonymous. Being homosexual is about how you live out your life. LGBT campaigning is about political activism and worldview. Not all people who choose to be homosexual are LGBT campaigners, and not all LGBT activists are homosexual. Presently, universities across the country offer courses in gay and lesbian studies where things such as ethics, queer philosophy, political science, sexology and the social construction of sexual identity are discussed. The outworking of these ideological positions has been mainstreamed into both education and culture. The entire premise, for example, behind the mandatory LGBT education of children in the United Kingdom is that it seeks to deconstruct heterosexual normativity. And this has led to some LGBTQ academics calling for the queering up of the primary school classroom. Precisely stated, LGBT activism is very real, it can be ideological, and at times aggressively so. So successful has the LGBT lobby been that even the simple premise that a child does better growing up with a mother and a father in a low-conflict home environment has been deemed homophobic and enough to disqualify someone from holding public office. Next week, here at Christian Concern, you will be hearing about the case of Richard Page. If ever there was a symbol for how badly the anti-discrimination agenda has failed Christians and what an existential threat it poses to religious freedom, then Richard is that symbol, and one that will occur in South Korea unless you hold back this anti-discrimination tide at the very beginning. Richard Page is a devout Christian who's always been active in the community. He performed exemplary service as a lay magistrate in Kent for 15 years, frequently presiding over adoption cases. He has served as a highly capable and popular non-executive director with a National Health Trust in our hospitals. In 2014, a social services was circulated among the magistrate judges, making sweeping statements about how new research findings suggested that an adopted child fares best when placed with same-sex couples as opposed to being placed with a mother and father. Richard disagreed with the report when it was presented to him in one of the adoption cases that he had to decide on. He said to two other magistrates behind closed doors that his first and foremost responsibility was to rule for an outcome that was in the best interests of the child. In this particular circumstance, the child had lived for 3 years with a married mother and father. Two gay men wanted to adopt the child, and Richard said that the child would do best to stay with the married mother and father. He also said that he believed that the social science showed that children do best with a married mum and father, and wanted to bring evidence to show a different viewpoint from the report that he was being presented with. He said that this belief also flowed from his faith as a Christian, that he too had practiced as a foster carer with children from broken and difficult homes. Richard and his wife have fostered several children for many years, so he is also able to draw upon his direct experience. Although this conversation was in the judge's retiring room and was personal reflections, and although the child was placed with that same-sex couple, Richard Page's comments were secretly reported to the judicial disciplinary process. By 2015, even though Richard had been subject to disciplinary meetings and equality and diversity training in order to re-educate him, he was suspended from the magistracy, from the judge's bench, pending investigation. The outcome in the investigation was that he had allowed his religious beliefs to affect his judicial decision-making, that he had been biased. So holding the belief as a Christian that children do best with a mother and father was deemed to be discriminatory, and that he should have removed himself from the case. You can imagine that the story of a magistrate being punished simply for suggesting that a child does best with a mother and father attracted a lot of media and public attention. Many people in the United Kingdom, not just Christians, feel the same way. The best available social science, psychology and anthropological evidence attest to the truth of Richard's statement. More than that, members of the judiciary, even the President of the Supreme Court and former head of the Family Division, frequently appear in the media here in the UK to express their views on such boldly contested issues. But they do so without punishment and are often celebrated for their desire to liberalise the law. This was not the case with Richard. By expressing a biblical truth, one which can also be evidenced through secular argument, Richard was removed from office. Just as egregious, the National Health Service also dismissed him from his position, even though his portfolio in the National Health Service had nothing to do with parenting issues or public policy. It was to do with finance. The National Health Service suggested that even allowing Richard to continue in his position might mean that LGBT people would be scared of seeking medical help if they were ill. This statement alone shocks the conscience. The idea that a Christian in a non-medical role who never sees patients could dissuade a sick person from getting medical treatment simply for believing a child does better with a mum and dad would be laughable, if not for the fact that a good man has lost his job and his reputation as a result of this type of thinking. The problem of how sexual orientation laws have ravaged religious freedom doesn't stop there. Let's start with a brief piece of history. In 2007, the UK adopted the Sexual Orientation Regulations, the predecessor of the Equality Act of 2010. In 2007, the same year the regulations were adopted. So bear this in mind if you are adopting anti-discrimination legislation. There were 14 Christian adoption agencies in the UK, 11 Catholic adoption agencies in England and Wales, 2 Roman Catholic adoption agencies in Scotland, and 1 evangelical adoption agency in England and Wales. As a result of the sexual orientation regulations, all 14 agencies suffered severe repercussions. Of those 14, several of which have existed for hundreds of years or more and were credited with placing the most difficult children into families, 11 of them were forced to remove their Christian ethos and become secular sounding agencies, or they would go out of business completely. To put this into perspective, the 2 Catholic agencies in Scotland accounted on average for 20% of the adoptions in Scotland each year. Of the 11 Catholic adoption agencies in England and Wales, they performed 1/3 of all private adoptions in the United Kingdom. Before closing its doors to business, the Westminster Catholic Children's Society alone provided services to more than 3,000 children. While we lament the loss of ethos-based adoption agencies because of gender politics, what is equally deplorable is that in the name of so-called sexual orientation, countless children will stay in orphanages or inadequate foster care because of the loss of these adoption agencies. Or we can look to the case of Gary McFarlane. He is a relationships counsellor. He was terminated from his position with Relate Counselling Service for gross misconduct, for merely asking if he could be accommodated in his Christian beliefs on biblical sexuality. He merely inquired about the possibility of not being required to give sex therapy to 2 men or 2 women that he might counsel. Gross misconduct is the harshest penalty available to an employer, and they suspended Gary and then dismissed him for gross misconduct for raising the possibility that he might have a conscience issue with giving sex therapy to 2 men or 2 women. There weren't even actual clients. He had an incredible record of counselling. People loved him. So his employment was terminated. His ability to be registered, his ability to get insurance, all came under the spotlight. Life became very difficult for him. Another case, Eunice and Owen Johns, long-time foster carers and devoted Christians. After having taken a break from fostering for a few years, they were then required to go through a new screening process, which of course is understandable with the local authority. Despite their long history of helping children in the most difficult of situations, Eunice and Owen John were rejected as foster parents because they were asked about their views on homosexuality and whether or not they would be able to encourage a child if they were expressing confusion or feelings of being gay. Please bear in mind that the age of the children that Eunice and Owen Johns were adopting was 6 and 7, and they were being asked to promote homosexuality to children in their care. During the trial, the taxpayer-funded Equality and Human Rights Commission condemned Mr. and Mrs. Johns, saying that allowing such people to foster children ran the risk of infecting the children with Christianity. It's a little bit like speaking of Christianity like it's coronavirus, some dangerous disease, some deadly disease which isn't fit to be in the public space. What was also extraordinary during this whole process, they wouldn't encourage homosexuality in children, so they weren't deemed fit to be foster carers or adoptive carers. But also, the adoption agency, the local authority felt that their church and the fact they had a lot of people home on a Sunday for Sunday lunch, that this was dangerous for children. To be in that kind of environment every Sunday would be a dangerous environment for the children. Slowly, however, Here at the Christian Legal Centre, and we've been going for a long time, ground is being won back by Christians. And one of the most well-known cases at the Christian Legal Centre is that of Felix Ngole. Felix is a Christian student who was removed from his master's degree in social work at the University of Sheffield after he made comments on his personal Facebook page in support of biblical teaching on marriage and sexual ethics. Felix was originally suspended and then removed from his course because he was told that he may have caused offence to some individuals and transgressed boundaries which are not deemed appropriate for someone entering the social work profession. I would suggest that the case represented an egregious incidence of viewpoint discrimination whereby Felix was discriminated not for the subject matter being addressed but for the side that he took in the debate. The case highlights the reality that some universities are seeking to create a bar to certain professions. Unless you think straight, unless you get with the LGBTQI anti-discrimination agenda, you're not fit to be a social worker, you're not fit to be a teacher, you're not fit to be a politician. The case highlights that this is the case. Counsel for the University of Sheffield, Sarah Hannett of Matrix Chambers, one of the most famous barristers' chambers in the country, told the court that the university's policy is not just that the services must be provided without discrimination, but that they must be seen to be provided, that they must be provided without perception of discrimination. And that required the removal of Mr. Ngole from the course. So a Christian with orthodox views on marriage, if that is perceived as someone who discriminates, should not be a social worker, should not be a counsellor, should not be a teacher. Sarah Hannett denied that there was a nexus, a connection between the sharing of his opinion on biblical marriage and his Christian faith. She then went on to argue that in fact Felix was not removed for what he said, but because of the way in which he said it, which was in fact quoting from the Bible. The reality, of course, is that this is a distinction without a difference. The genuineness of this argument also smacks of dubiousness, as no students from the University of Sheffield who have used their Facebook pages to promote social views which the university agrees with, including on issues involving LGBTQI issues, have ever been punished. The High Court found against Felix and the case was appealed. Before the Court of Appeal, counsel for the University of Sheffield, Sarah Hannett, went so far as to say that even Mother Teresa of Calcutta would be barred from social work if she had expressed her views about homosexuality. She argued that even speaking against same-sex marriage in a Bible study should be enough to exclude you from a social work profession. In a sense, she went too far, because on that day in that court, reason won the day, and the Court of Appeal overturned the lower court's earlier ruling, making it clear that the expressing of a Christian opinion is wholly different from engaging in an act of discrimination. The court said Felix had never discriminated against a service user, nor was there any indication that he ever would. Let me just say that this is also the case for Eunice and Owen Johns. They provided the best situation for their children, nor is this the case for Gary McFarlane, who was the best kind of counsellor. This case stands for the fundamental principle that the Christians enjoy the same freedoms to express their opinions as everyone else in the public sphere, without fear of being expelled from their profession of choice or otherwise punished. Despite this victory, the equality agenda still poses a very real threat to Christian freedoms. As I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, equality law typically starts off with relatively humble goals, but then slowly expands into every sphere of our lives, including those that relate to the free exercise of our Christian faith, and how our children are educated. In Europe and in the UK, schools are legally obliged to respect the way that parents wish to raise their children in accordance with their Christian faith. However, with the introduction of the Equality Act in 2010, the Department of Education made it mandatory that the various protected characteristics, including sexual orientation and gender reassignment, should be promoted. Little guidance was provided to schools, but one thing was clear. The various educational bodies, locally and nationally, encourage schools to promote LGBT education. It has got to the point in the UK that the government has adopted new education regulations requiring schools at the secondary level to teach LGBTQI elements in all schools, including Christian schools, with no right of opt-out. Primary schools are also under heavy pressure to engage in LGBT issues. I think that many of us have had, historically, in the United Kingdom, an implicit trust in the education of our children by the state. Again, what I want to say to you in South Korea is keep your children safe. Understand what it is that they are being taught. If you don't want these programs in your schools, ensure that they don't ever enter your schools, that this does not become part of the curriculum. This needs to be a stated campaign aim of anything that you can do. You need to bring in the politicians, the educators, the pastors, the lawyers in order to ensure that this happens. Until recently, one of the chief executives of Ofsted, which is the the United Kingdom's official school inspectorate, was also one of the senior managers of Stonewall, which is the major LGBT lobby group in the United Kingdom. Stonewall is an LGBT organisation active in many spheres of culture, including politics and education. They are very clear about their campaigning goals, which are anti-ethical to biblical Christianity. They are equally clear that they feel Christianity must change and accept homosexuality as a virtue and condemn any Christian who does not. In fact, currently there is a movement in our nation to ban so-called conversion therapy. What does this mean? Well, actually telling someone that they can turn to Christ, they can give up their sexual behaviour, if they can give that up, they can leave it at the foot of the cross. That, the sort of terms that we're hearing in Parliament and even in the church, is spiritual abuse for telling people that they can change. So this is something that you need to be very alive to. Spiritual abuse, conversion therapy, terrible terms which become used against Christians in order to make any explanation that we push back on not able to be heard by others. Government itself has become a cheerleader in this country for LGBT education. The partner of our current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Carrie, was judging recently at the Conservative Party, at the Conservative Party's LGBT Fringe Conference Centre. She was judging drag karaoke. So the Conservative Party has become dominated, completely acquiescent to this particular agenda. If you were to enter the Department of Education building in Westminster, a stone's throw away from Parliament, you might be surprised to see that the only visible symbol in the main entrance is a large rainbow flag that decorates 2 floors of the building. I say this because your Department of Education, your Department of Health, your Department of Justice, you must ensure that they don't adopt this. That they don't feel that in the name of anti-discrimination they have to fly flags, that they have to introduce these policies. They need to be resisted from the outset. The Department of Education has rolled out new tags for their email signatures, including a rainbow flag with the slogan, I am an LGBTQ I'm an LGBT plus champion, and directed them to the Stonewall website. The signature line ends with the following statement, I quote, "We cannot tell by looking at someone or by their name how they self-define their gender," and warning the reader to be sensitive to the use of gender-specific programs. This is our government. This is our government's education department. This is the education department that delivers education to children right down to 2 in our nursery schools. Given this, it's not surprising to hear stories like those of Izzy Montague and her experience at Heaver's Farm School. Izzy and her husband Shane are Bible-believing Christians who wanted to raise their son Isaiah in accordance with their Christian beliefs. Izzy was troubled when she began seeing Stonewall posters popping up all over the school with slogans like, "I am gay, get over it." Her son was also coming home from school and telling her that he had to read storybooks about being gay. This all culminated in the school announcing that they would be holding a gay pride event at their school. The child in question was 6. Any parent who complained received a similar answer, which was that their children could not be opted out of LGBT education as it was mandated by law. Izzy formally complained to the school, noting that the school owed her a statutory duty to respect her right to raise her son in accordance with her Christian beliefs. When she went to meet the head teacher as part of the complaints procedure, she was greeted by the head teacher's daughter, who was taking notes of the meeting. The daughter, also a member of staff, wore a T-shirt with a conspicuous message written in bold black lettering saying, "Why be homophobic or transphobic when you can just be quiet?" The daughter also wore T-shirts to the primary school. One such T-shirt also read, "I am a lesbian." So teachers in the school of young children aged 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are wearing T-shirts saying, "I'm a lesbian. Why be homophobic or transphobic when you can just be quiet?" Not surprisingly, a few weeks later, when Izzy received the official written response to her complaint from the head teacher, they absolved the school of any wrongdoing and defended the school's position of holding a pride event. While this wasn't surprising, what was indeed surprising was that on the same day that letter was sent out, that same teacher put Izzy's son, just a small boy, into a 4-hour detention. To be clear, Izzy's son had never shown any behavioural problems at a school, nor had he ever served a detention. He was only, I said 6 years old, in fact he was only 5 years old, putting a 5-year-old into a 4-hour detention. Izzy was only told that evening that one of the teachers had physically handled him on his lower back. The next day, Izzy's son was again put into detention. Izzy, as any mother would, tried desperately to find out what happened, especially about the accusation of being physically manhandled. The school, in return, was awful to her. They provided no means or answers and ultimately barred Izzy from coming onto the school grounds. Izzy's story is becoming symbolic of the disdain equality and education activists have for the role of parents in educating their own children. I've been told by multiple school governors when handling complaints for other Christian parents that in their minds, parents are part of the problem and not the solution. They have told me that they have bypassed consulting parents on intimate and moral issues being taught in schools because they know that they will get pushback. So this begs the question as to what kind of response is that to genuine parental concerns when the law of the land requires parents to be consulted on these very questions. And it's why in South Korea what's very important that you ensure that the governance of your school remains Christian, remains, and that you're keeping your children safe, and you're very invested in the curriculum for your children's school. This is a very, very important area to keep safe because, as you can see in the United Kingdom, it has been entirely queered. Our failure in the United Kingdom to understand where anti-discrimination leads has led to the systemic and systematic punishment of people with deeply held biblical beliefs. At the Christian Legal Centre last year, we gave advice to some 1,000 Christians who felt they'd suffered some level of detriment for their Christian faith. The centre is currently supporting more than 50 court cases involving Christian freedoms that are live in court, that are active. These numbers are unacceptable for a nation that for so long identified with Christianity, one which has given birth to some of our most famous global evangelists, theologians and reformers. The other protected characteristic I would like to address today, because it's also very damaging to both Christian freedoms and to the culture at large, is gender reassignment. Nigel and Sari Rowe are Christian parents who hold and wish to instill in their children a biblically centred belief in gender, beliefs that would include Genesis 1:27, where Scripture says, "So God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." Or Matthew 19:4, where Christ says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" In seeking to raise their children to the Christian beliefs, Nigel and Sally Rowe sent their two sons to a Church of England primary school on the Isle of Wight. Within 2 school years, both of their children, aged 6 and 8 at the time, found themselves in classes with boys who, under their parents and the school's direction, were going to school identifying as girls. Because of the confusion and discomfort suffered by their older son, Nigel and Sally Rowe took him out of school to be home educated. When the school informed Nigel and Sally Rowe of their plan to adopt a transgender affirming policy in the school, the reality was this: these small children, aged 6, 7, 8, in a small community, had known these other children, had known these little boys as boys. Now they were coming to school as girls. And if the other children didn't call these children by the right name or by the right pronoun, they would be in trouble. We had situations whereby the children were not going to toilet at school because they were getting so concerned about the use of toilets, this sort of thing in the school. Nigel and Sally attempted to work the matter out with the school in relation to their younger son. In a response to a letter they sent to the school, asking about anti-bullying measures and their own parental rights, the school responded by suggesting that anyone who could not believe that those little boys were girls or refused to give them female pronouns was transphobic. The school also announced their intention to educate parents and students alike in accordance with this gender ideology. Furthermore, the school and the education department was supported by the church, by the church's diocesan education body, in support of this gender ideology. So a church school, capitulated to the state agenda, and the true Christian parents who were seeking to protect not just their children and others, they were punished as transphobic. The result is that now Nigel and Sally have been home educating their children for some 3 years, and litigation is about to commence imminently. Similarly, the Christian Legal Centre has supported an amazing maths teacher called Joshua Sutcliffe. He was sacked for saying "well done girls" to a group of girls in a maths class. The children were aged 15, but one of the girls identified as a boy. As a result of this, not immediately, but a week later, the parent of the child complained about Joshua Sutcliffe, and Joshua Sutcliffe was put into isolation as a maths teacher in the school every day. He was told to come in, prepare the lessons and give them to a supply teacher. More recently, the Christian Legal Centre supported the Reverend John Parker, who was a governor of a Church of England school. He resigned because the school was aggressively pushing a trans agenda led by a radical transgender campaigning group called Mermaids. One of the children in the school was wanting to transition. The child was 8 or 9, and this John Parker raised issues about how this was going to be communicated to the children and to the parents, and raised issues over the mermaids coming into the school. For doing this, he was punished. He was pushed out. Did the Church of England Diocesan Education Authority stand with him? No. So again, the church punished him. Rather than going in a Church of England school, in a Christian school, and giving a Christian framework, which they could have done within the law, the church punished him. So this is my warning to South Korea. It's very subtle. Christians from the outset are made to look like people who are old-fashioned, fuddy-duddy, backward, irritable, irritating, nasty. The gay icon is made to look modern, beautiful, attractive, tolerant. But in fact, the LGBTQI agenda is deeply intolerant, and it absolutely punishes. It can't stand those that will not stand with it. And it does not care if parents are forced to take their children out of school. It does not care if a judge loses his job. It does not care. They want this. And the point is, for most, what also happens is that the church goes silent and everyone goes silent. So most people don't get punished because they're just silent. Those that dare to speak get punished, and that makes more people silent. I really hope and pray that South Korea will understand this and resist this. Transgender theory's impact has also been felt beyond our schools. The Christian Legal Centre is supporting Dr. David Makareth. He worked as a disability allowance assessor for the Department of Work and Pensions as a medical doctor. His employer presented him with a scenario about a transgender client expecting to be referred to in their chosen pronoun. And Dr. Makareth, as a medical doctor, said that he would not be able to call a biological man a woman or a biological woman a man because this has an impact on medicine. It has an impact on health. His comment led to disciplinary inquiries and further training by his employer, followed by a warning that he would be very likely to lose his job should he not comply with the transgendered person's wish and refer to them by their gender pronoun. In the final email exchange with his employer, Dr. Makareth was instructed to follow the process as discussed in your training, or in the alternative, if however you do not want to do this, we will respect your decision and your right to leave your contract. To which Dr. Makareth replied, I am a Christian and in good conscience cannot do what the department is, again, a government department of work and pensions, is requiring of me. So a government department in work and pensions is forcing a medical doctor to sign a medical document as a lie and is forcing him to lose his job. So Dr. Makareth felt coerced to leave his work and did so with great sadness in June of 2018. He was suspended from his duties during the same month, followed by a summary dismissal. He went on to say publicly, no doctor or researcher or philosopher can demonstrate or prove that a person can change sex. Without intellectual and moral integrity, medicine cannot function, and my 30 years as a doctor are now considered irrelevant compared to the risk that someone else might be offended. Please pray for Dr. Makareth as his case continues. We sincerely believe that the case will set an important principle and precedent for Christians in the United Kingdom. In bringing this talk to a conclusion, I would just like to thank everyone for their deep desire to keep Korea safe from this type of cultural influence that we have had in the UK, which has led to a strong suppression of Christian exercise in every sphere of life. You are the frontline warriors for what is good and what is right and what is pleasing to God in your nation. In the United Kingdom, I do believe that we have lost our way. Views that show dissent from the sexual orthodoxy of the day are punished and shouted down. So we need people like you to learn from what has happened to us. People willing to stand up for the truth, no matter what the consequences. But people to understand what comes and to resist it from the outset. Do not be naive. Do not be naive. Do not, in fact, have the kind of the Christian naivety. Truth and grace, grace and truth. Understand from what has happened to us what will come, unless you resist, because it's your children, it's your children's lives that will be at stake. I thank you for taking a brave stand. I thank you for what you do. God bless South Korea.